So Dmitry Bivol scores a 12-round unanimous decision over Saul Canelo Alvarez in fairly straightforward fashion, it has to be said. Now, in standard outmatch boxing fashion, I'm quite late to the party, so I imagine that most of you have heard other people's takes, heard their round by round breakdown, seen highlights, probably even seen the fight yourself. So I'm not going to bore you by rehashing all these things you've heard before. I'm actually going to dive straight into the kind of the path to victory for Dmitry Bivol, because when I watched this fight, he does so much right. And yeah, let's explore it and see what we can find. So the first thing, and I don't think this is going to surprise anyone, it certainly didn't surprise me when I've watched the fight, is the volume coming from the lead left hand of Dmitry Bivol. As in standard fashion for Bivol, he's using it almost exclusively. And now, this is an idea that you typically hear, even at the lower levels of boxing when you're just starting out, is how important is your lead hand? And now we can get into how you can manipulate which hand is your lead hand. There are methods of doing that, but the essence of the advice is use your lead hand. The old saying is the right hand can take you around the block, but the jab can take you around the world. Well, it's not as simple as that. It's because it's not just having a fast jab, having a consistent jab or lead hand. It's the application of it. And what we see from Dmitry Bivol is he knows how to use it. But most importantly, he knows how to vary it. And so he has it a high volume of punches with that left hand, with that lead hand. But he varies the purpose of it, if that makes sense. So sometimes he'll use a traditional jab, your kind of standard textbook jab to set up a right hand or whatever. Sometimes it's a bit more of a rhythmic probe. He'll condition his opponent using a rhythm, just to use it to just touch their guard, just make some contact with them, just to keep the opponent at bay and maybe get a reaction from them. Other times he'll use it in a bit more of a stiff arm fashion, where he'll blind an opponent. And what we see from Canelo Alvarez is, being the shorter man looking to come forward, he's making use of a high guard, which he does quite often. And I've spoken many times about how different guards, different positions and whatnot, everything in boxing has a kind of a kryptonite to it. And the kryptonite for the high guard is the lack of vision, the limited vision. And you can further limit that vision by using your lead hand to blind your opponent and restrict their vision even more. And that's what Bivol was doing. So he had like three main functions of his lead hand, three main variations, and he was using these constantly to engage the guard of Canelo, and would do so while taking an angle. So he'd be in front of Canelo, he'd engage the guard, maybe set up some offense, but he wouldn't just stay in front of Canelo. He'd move off the center line, move out of the engagement, but not just backwards. He'd do it at an angle, so that constantly meant that Canelo had to not follow him, but had no choice but to reset. He couldn't just follow him, is what I'm trying to say. And Canelo famously doesn't have the quickest feet, probably isn't the most agile in terms of his footwork, and this proved to be a massive win for Bivol. Canelo, on the other hand, he used much less variation with the lead hand in particular. And it's not really that surprising, because Canelo, he isn't that kind of guy. He's not the most accomplished boxer at long range. He's no slouch, however, but he's not like a Bivol, who kind of does his best work at long range and has plenty of variation, plenty of experience, and knows what he wants to do. But Canelo has pretty much opted to just follow up his traditional jab with some right hands. There was seem to be a pattern early on where he was looping his right hooks, and to be fair to him, he did try to vary that one punch. Sometimes he'd throw it to the head, sometimes he'd throw a bit lower. But Bivol's movement just resulted in these shots being ineffective regardless of where Canelo was aiming. And it's not to completely slag Canelo off, because he's an excellent fighter. So he was scoring some shots here and there. I can barely speak. I'm very tired. Excuse me. because Canelo is a world level fighter. So he is able to set things up, and he is able to use his eyes and find a shot. He had some success with the uppercut in particular, but Bivol was just too active at long range, and you know it can be seen that Canelo's greatest success was when he uses that misdirection that he's become so famous for. Sometimes he'd jab to the head, he'd left hook to the body, and then finish up with a jab to the head. It's stuff like that, and he can do it with uppercuts and body shots. But it was only when, I don't want you to misconstrue what I'm saying, but it was almost like he only got that opportunity when Bivol allowed him to, when Bivol was a bit more stationary. And Bivol has great mobility, as we all know, but not only does he have that mobility, but it lasts for the entirety of a fight, which is very, very impressive. Because, yeah, Bivol isn't the biggest light heavyweight, but size really isn't everything. Being a smaller man does come with its advantages. But Canelo, being the smaller man in comparison to Bivol, didn't really enjoy any of those advantages. Because he wasn't as mobile, he wasn't really as agile, he didn't even seem as fast as Bivol. Certainly wasn't as powerful. His stamina wasn't even as good, which is unlikely, which is kind of strange, because typically smaller guys have better stamina, better energy level than bigger guys. But we know Canelo does have some suspect stamina, and he's really just not the kind of person who I think inherently is going to have great stamina, relatively speaking, compared to other boxers. But yeah, Bivol just really just outclassed him in every single department, at least in my opinion. There was nothing that Canelo did in this fight where I thought he's done that much better than Bivol. Canelo's a very accomplished combination puncher, but as I say, it was very situational because it was only when Bivol was in front of him. But even then, Bivol got off combinations of his own, not just with straight shots as well. Sometimes he was mixing in body shots, hooking punches. His hooking punches aren't the best, but he wasn't really going for all-out power. It was like every shot was a kind of, I don't know, 70%. He wasn't really nailing Canelo with anything, but I think that's really the best approach to take, because Canelo, he is slippery, and he displayed that in this fight. He does his tricky little head movement, especially on the ropes, and he is very difficult to pin down because, yeah, he's a young guy. Him and Bivol are both 31 years old, I believe. But Canelo's been a pro since he was 15 years old, so he is a veteran at this stage. And he is still very hard to pin down. He's very wily, very defensively minded these days. He doesn't enjoy being hit clean, and so it makes it very difficult for you to hit him clean. And so Bivol, as I say, opted for the right approach, where it was move off, jab, jab, move off, constantly moving at an angle, not really allowing himself to get kind of stuck on the back half of his stance like we saw from Caleb Plant, because I think Bivol really showed that. And I don't want to diss Caleb Plant, this is nothing personal, but Caleb Plant, I think he is a bit more flash than substance. And Caleb Plant fought a very good fight. He surprised me in that fight, but defensively, distance is defense. And Caleb Plant was someone who had good feet, and I don't think he really utilized it, not in the way that Bivol did in this fight. So, but that's off on a tangent, talking about Caleb Plant. But Bivol showed that there is a way to beat Canelo Alvarez. And I really think that he kind of took some elements that were made apparent in the Sergey Kovalev fight. But obviously we know that Bivol, fresher, younger, more disciplined, tougher, just more athletic, maybe not as technically good, but he didn't necessarily have to be, because he was able to exploit Canelo's weaknesses that I feel were kind of highlighted in not just the Sergey Kovalev fight, but I think that's most recently that fight. And yeah, Bivol really just fought an excellent fight. I couldn't really fault him too much. Bivol did another excellent thing where he'd bear in mind he's throwing and landing combinations at Canelo, and he'd do something that Usyk and Jack Catterall have done very well, which is finish combinations on the jab, on the lead hand. And As I say, Usyk does this very well. You can look at that in the AJ fight, but also throughout his career. But especially Jack Catterall used this to good success, a good effect against Josh Taylor, where you finished your combination, and rather just, I don't know, rolling off or taking a step back, or, you know, God forbid, just staying on the centre line for your opponent to respond, you finish on a straight left, or, you know, a straight lead hand, because what it does, it takes you to the back half of your stance, and it kind of brings you towards the exit of that engagement, and it just makes it difficult for your opponent to actually look to capitalise on you. It's just basically a form of defensive responsibility, and Bivol does that so well. He drills it on the pads and he's shadow boxing on the bag, and it pays dividends. Bivol also utilised great timing, stepping back, especially to make Canelo fall short, who, you know, his feet don't necessarily keep up with him per se. And what he'd do was he'd make Canelo fall short, and then rather than just kind of staying at distance and then they come back into another engagement, Bivol would use his kind of momentum to bounce back in to the engagement and re-enter that engagement and capitalize on Canelo's lack of defensive responsibility, this is just boxing 101. And that is really, in essence, what Bivol did. I don't want to say he beat Canelo up. He was piecing him up at times, just using the sweet science of boxing. And it really was a great performance. As I say, I can't really say Bivol put a foot wrong. I gave Canelo Alvarez 3 rounds, maybe 4 rounds if I'm being generous, but everything else I think was just Dmitry Bivol. Just a great performance, and it's a lot of people have spoken about the kind of the most shocking thing is that not necessarily that Bivol performed the way he did, but it's the fact that he got the decision. Because yeah, there was some you know, it's probably a bit close on the scorecards, but he did get the decision, and yeah, it's kind of, has the boxing world grown a conscience all of a sudden? But yeah, that is my take of this fight. Onwards and upwards for Dmitry Bivol, and also Canelo. You know, he's a great fighter, and he didn't necessarily have to take this fight. Undisputed at super middleweight, he could have stayed there. He could have retired. He's had a long enough career. But this is a man who wants to challenge himself and really test his limits against a guy in Dmitry Bivol who is a very good fighter, but is largely unknown to the wider boxing public. Probably doesn't bring that much money to the table, even though he is a champion. But Canelo really did look to enhance his legacy even further with this fight. And he came up short against a much better man who fought a damn near perfect fight. So, yeah, you know, I tip my hat to both men. It's like, I'm excited to see where both of them go next. So, yeah, this is just a little kind of technical assessment, and hope it's interesting. I hope it's enlightening. Maybe you can rewatch the fight now and kind of see the things that I've highlighted in this video. Let me know what you think of this fight. What did you make of the performance of both men? Do you agree with my take? Disagree? It's all good. Just leave it down below. I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll catch you in the next video.